Discovered my dad cheating while my mom was recovering from a stroke. He left us after I confronted him, and now he's blaming me for his divorce. So I'm 17 and female, and growing up, my mom and I were super close. Honestly, it wasn't that hard because my mom is literally the kindest, most awesome person I know. Ever since I can remember, she's treated me like her best friend. She's always been a girl's girl, so I could spill my guts to her about anything without worrying she'd judge or get mad at me. We had the best time shopping sprees, movie marathons, and salon days were our thing. But just because she was chill and friendly didn't mean she let me run wild. I still had a curfew, and I knew my boundaries and respected them. My dad, though, was a whole different story. He always felt like he didn't really want to be a dad. Even though he was a stay-at-home parent, he never spent any quality time with me. Apart from the basics, like dropping me off and picking me up from school, he was mostly in his room, glued to his video games. There were so many times my mom would come home after a long day at work to find my dad still gaming, not bothering to cook dinner or do any chores. This obviously led to a lot of fights, with my dad storming out in anger. As I got older, I started to see how toxic his behavior was. My mom would beg him to get a job, or at least help out around the house, but he always had some excuse, saying he was playing games for research purposes to improve his skills for a job he might get someday. My dad had a computer science degree and had a decent job when he and my mom first got together, but when she got pregnant with me, he got laid off because his company downsized. He even suggested my mom get an abortion, but she refused. They agreed that she would work to support us while he took care of me in the house, but that was supposed to be temporary, yet he never went back to work. By the time I was 6, even my friends were teasing me because my dad was jobless and their parents would gossip about my family. It wasn't just that my dad did nothing, he also let himself go, gaining weight and neglecting basic self-care. He'd often ask neighborhood moms to drop me off at school because he couldn't be bothered to wake up early. Sometimes he'd forget to pick me up, and luckily one of my classmates' parents would give me a ride home. I'd come in to find him still playing games or napping, completely oblivious. My mom saw what was happening and decided enough was enough. She packed our bags and we moved in with her parents for a bit. I remember my dad coming over, trying to convince her not to go through with the divorce. Even my grandparents supported her and warned my dad that he needed to step up or it was over. Miraculously, my dad realized he needed to change. He started waking up early for runs, and he made an effort to pick me up and drop me off at my grandparents' place. We had actual conversations, and I started opening up to him. On weekends, he'd take me to the park to play badminton. For the first time ever, I actually had fun with him. My mom noticed these positive changes, and after a lot of back and forth discussions, she decided to move back in with him. My dad began living a healthier lifestyle, lost some weight, and even landed a job. It didn't pay as much as my mom's, but it was a good start. You'd think this would be the end of our problems, right? Well, not quite. My dad started coming home late and was constantly on his phone. If I tried to talk to him, he'd ignore me like I wasn't even there. He stopped spending any time with me and went back to being his old distant self. My mom grew more suspicious of his behavior and tried talking to him about it, but he'd just brush her off, saying she was overreacting. But you know how a woman's intuition is never wrong? She eventually found inappropriate texts between him and his personal trainer on his phone. She absolutely lost it, and they had a massive fight. My dad was furious that she had snooped on his phone and kept calling her a backstabber. For the first time, I saw both my parents screaming at each other, and it terrified me. Back when I was a kid, things at home got pretty rough. One day, during a heated argument, my dad accidentally punched my mom in the face. Blood started pouring from her nose, and seeing her in pain freaked me out. I had never seen so much blood before, and I was terrified she might die. We rushed to the hospital, and on the way, my dad kept warning me not to tell anyone the truth. He told me to say that Mom hit her face on a door if anyone asked. He said if I told the truth, he'd be taken away, and it would be all my fault. As a kid, I didn't want to lose my dad, so I kept quiet. Once my mom recovered, my dad promised her he'd cut off all ties with his personal trainer and change his ways. So my mom didn't press charges, and life went back to normal, as if nothing had ever happened. Fast forward to when I was 11, and my mom and I used to visit her college best friend Marie and her husband Larry every summer. We'd spend a week or two at their cabin, and I always had a blast with Marie's nieces and nephews. My dad usually stayed behind, but one summer he decided to join us. The first few days were uneventful, but then one sunny afternoon I got restless and went for a walk in the woods. I wish I hadn't because I stumbled upon my dad making out with Marie. They weren't even trying to hide it, and if my mom or Larry had come by, they would have seen it too. I was so shocked and scared that I quietly ran back, feeling nauseous from what I'd just witnessed. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want my dad to get mad at me, but I also didn't want to betray my mom. Thankfully, I didn't have to keep it a secret for long. Larry saw my dad kissing Marie by the. My dad had this nasty habit of always complaining and squeezing money out of my grandparents, claiming it was all for taking care of my mom or covering the rent and bills. I always knew the kind of person he was, and I started growing more and more suspicious. It wasn't long before I noticed him constantly on his phone, chatting with someone, just like he used to do before. It didn't take me long to come up with a plan to check his messages through his MacBook to figure out what he was up to. So, there I was snooping around, and I found out he was in constant touch with a woman named Angie. Now, I didn't go through all their messages because that would have been totally inappropriate, but just from the last few, it was crystal clear my dad was cheating on my mom again. This time, though, it felt much more serious. The stakes were higher. I couldn't even begin to imagine the heartbreak my mom would feel if she found out, especially considering her fragile state of mind already. I was so angry, I knew I had to do something. In my naive teenage mind, I thought, why not just get rid of the problem at the source? So I tried grabbing my dad's phone to delete all their messages and block Angie, hoping she would never contact him again. Maybe, just maybe, this would stop him from cheating. Of course, that plan backfired spectacularly. My dad quickly noticed Angie was blocked and confronted me, yelling about how I had the nerve to mess with his phone. I couldn't hold back. I yelled right back at him, telling him I was fed up with his constant cheating on my mom. His face turned bright red with embarrassment. He tried playing innocent, telling me I was too young to understand what was happening and that I should mind my own business. That made me even angrier. I told him I knew he was cheating with Angie and that I had seen him kissing another woman, Marie, years ago. I let him know I had known all along what kind of person he truly was. Our shouting match was so intense that my grandmother came into the living room looking concerned. She immediately sensed something serious was going on. My dad started spluttering, trying to explain that this was none of my business and that I was too young to talk to him this way. He even tried to gaslight me, insisting that as a parent he deserved my respect. But I wasn't having any of it. I had stayed silent for too long out of fear, but seeing my mom get sicker had made me protective. I wasn't going to let him hurt her again. I pointed out how all my classmates had happy families, and none of their dads cheated on their moms. I was so upset that I told him I was ashamed to have him as a father, and even wished he wasn't my dad. Maybe I didn't mean it at that moment, but it struck a nerve with him. He asked if I was serious, and I nodded. I told him I was sick of his behavior, and that my mom deserved so much better than him. My outburst shook him. The next moment, he angrily declared he was done with us. I watched in shock as he started packing his bags. My grandmother kept asking him what he was doing, but he told her this is why he never wanted kids. They just ruin everything. He claimed he had tried his best to be there for my mom in her tough time, but after hearing me talk this way, he was done. He said he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in an unhappy relationship and that Angie loved him very much, so he was going to move in with her. My grandmother yelled at him, calling him a pathetic and deadbeat father, but it didn't seem to bother him. He had already made up his mind. The last image I have of my dad is him walking out of the house with his bags, not even bothering to say goodbye. Everything happened so fast that I barely had time to process it. I knew I had spoken my truth, but seeing him leave was still incredibly hard. I burst into tears, blaming myself for making him move out. But my grandmother assured me it wasn't my fault. She said my dad was just a loser looking for an excuse to leave, and that it had nothing to do with me. It was hard to believe because I was the one who shouted at him. I was so upset I didn't even realize I would have to break the news to my poor mom. As I cried even more, dreading the thought of breaking her heart and affecting her recovery, we decided to wait for my granddad to arrive so we could together gently break the news to her. So it was surprising how well my mom took the news way better than I had braced for. She looked absolutely shocked at first and kept trying to call my dad over and over, but he just wouldn't pick up. After a while of processing her emotions, I think she must have noticed the fear in my eyes because she suddenly called me over for a hug. She assured me I had nothing to worry about and said she always knew Dad was a bit of a coward. I completely broke down in her arms, crying and apologizing for everything that had gone wrong. She told me she had no idea how much pain I'd been balling up all these years to protect their feelings and promised we'd manage fine without him. It was a huge relief that she wasn't blaming me like I thought she would. I mean, I was blaming myself and felt really guilty for everything that had happened. In the months following that, my mom focused on getting better, and my grandparents moved in with us to take care of her full time. They were a massive help, and it meant I could go to school every day knowing she was in good hands. I picked up a part-time job tutoring some students to bring in a little extra money, nothing major, but it felt good to contribute and help my grandparents out while Mom recovered. Throughout all of this, Dad never bothered to call, even though I tried reaching out to him several times and sent him a few texts apologizing. It felt so surreal and hurtful that my own dad didn't even care and I ought to check on us. When Mom finally recovered and was back to her old self, it felt like a miracle. The doctor said she was completely okay, and I was so grateful to God for that. The past few months had been mentally and physically exhausting. Once Mom was better, the first thing she did was find a divorce lawyer to start the process of divorcing Dad. You might wonder why Dad hadn't filed for divorce yet despite moving out. It was obvious he didn't want to pay child support or health insurance and was dragging his feet. When Mom got the divorce papers, she tried to contact him to mail them, which is when he finally reached out after months of silence. Yesterday he called and asked if she was serious about divorcing him after reading her texts. Mom, being firm, told him it was indeed serious, and she was going through with it no matter what. Dad, being the lowlife he is, started begging her not to go through with it, saying his girlfriend had broken up with him soon after he left us, and that he'd been living alone in a motel, too scared to return. He claimed he had always hoped that after Mom recovered, they could have an honest conversation. He said he never imagined she'd go ahead and file for divorce. He begged her to reconsider, but Mom stood her ground and said if he didn't sign the papers, she'd take him to court. They argued, and I don't know if he finally agreed or not. Since then, Dad has sent me several messages and voicemails, blaming me for everything. In a couple of his voicemails, he was outright yelling, saying I ruined his life and was the reason for the divorce. He even went as far as to say he wished I was never born. I showed these to Mom, who was furious, and told me he was just a manipulator refusing to accept his own mistakes. Still, I can't shake off the guilt because a part of me agrees with him. I wanted to share my story on Reddit to see if anyone else thinks I'm to blame just like Dad does for their divorce. Am I the asshole for not controlling my anger that day, which led to Dad walking out? Has anyone else gone through something similar? My mom loves me a lot and might be trying not to blame me to protect me from the truth. I don't want to be the cause of her unhappiness, so please be honest in the comments. Update: I've been crying while reading all your comments. It's overwhelming to realize there are so many strangers out there who've been hurt just like I have. For the first time, I don't feel alone. It's strange reading everyone else's stories about their own dysfunctional families because I always thought everyone else's life was perfect. I guess everyone has their struggles. Some of you have actually blamed me for my parents' divorce, and while that's painful to hear, reading all these stories has made me realize it was better for me to speak my mind to Dad rather than keep things bottled up and pretend he was a good person. I didn't force him to cheat or ask him to leave us. That was entirely his decision. Just to clarify, hey, just in case it wasn't super clear earlier, I'm actually really glad that my parents are getting divorced. I just want my mom to be happy, and I think she's finally serious about this decision. For those who've been asking if the house belongs to my mom, it doesn't. We're renting, and after covering all her medical treatments, she doesn't really have any assets left. So she won't lose anything in the divorce with my dad. Update time. It's been a month since my last update, and wow, a lot has happened. First things first, my dad showed up at our doorstep after being MIA for months. He came to apologize to my mom. He looked rough, like he'd had a really bad time, and even had this thick beard going on. At first, my grandparents wouldn't let him in, but he kept apologizing, just wanting one last chat with Mom. She eventually let him in, and he started apologizing for everything. He literally broke down, saying he'd had time to think, and realized how amazing Mom was and how he should have cherished her all along. He went on about how Angie, his fling, wasn't even half the woman Mom is, and he figured this out only after moving in with her. They met online, and he thought it was going to be this fairy tale romance, but it turned out to be a disaster. They fought a lot, and eventually Angie kicked him out in the middle of the night, leaving him homeless. He couldn't come back here, so he ended up living in a motel, often drinking alone and being late for work. Eventually, he got laid off a few weeks ago. He broke down, begging Mom to believe he was done with his old ways and that he was going to change. I know it sounds pretty emotional, but knowing my dad, I couldn't help but laugh. His tears looked so fake and forced. Mom wasn't buying it either. She smiled and asked him to stop pretending. She shoved the divorce papers in his face, telling him to sign them right then and there so she could file them. Dad tried to refuse, but my grandparents threatened to investigate his finances and take legal action for the thousands he took from them, including their jewelry. They were convinced he didn't spend all that money on us and must have spent it on his new girlfriend. Mom assured him that the longer he dragged this out, the more lawyer fees he'd have to pay, and we had plenty of proof of his abuse. My dad had the audacity to turn to me, asking if I was happy with what he'd done, shaking his head in disgust, suggesting I should have kept my mouth shut. Hearing this, I laughed at the absurdity while Mom yelled at him for being an entitled jerk. I pointed out that he'd cheated on his wife multiple times and now was trying to blame me for his own actions. My laughter seemed to get to him even more, and he glared at me, muttering curses. Grandpa forcefully handed him a pen and demanded he sign the papers and leave. It was so refreshing to see my whole family stand up against him. In the end, he had no choice but to sign. Mom promised this would be the last time I'd ever see him, as she didn't want him near me to further traumatize me. Update 3. Hey guys, it's been a few months since my last update. My parents finally got divorced. It wasn't smooth, but I'm so relieved that Mom and I are free of him. The court ordered Dad to pay for my college expenses until I graduate, which is kind of poetic justice since he's hardly ever done anything for me. Mom's much healthier now and has started exercising regularly to keep in check. To all those asking why Dad kept blaming me, I realize now he knew how good he had it with Mom and was terrified of losing such a dependable partner. Instead of being an adult about it, he decided to blame me for no reason. I see that more clearly now, and I'm even more glad I spoke my mind to him all those months ago. My grandparents have finally moved back to their place after living with us for months to take care of Mom. We visit them every weekend because I've grown really attached to them. Mom started looking for a new job while still tutoring. We might not have a lot right now, but we both feel so much freer than before. I took some of your advice and have decided to go for therapy when I head off to college. I've also started journaling, which is surprisingly helpful. Thank you to everyone who stuck by me these last few months and offered support and encouragement. I'm really grateful and won't be deleting my post like I originally thought. If anyone else out there is going through what my mom and I did, I want them to find this. I hope it brings them comfort to know that things eventually get better with time. We faced some tough times, but slowly things started looking up. So hang in there, it does get better.